the connection with the ideas of progress and the ideas of technological rationality is with prenatal testing. In many parts of Europe, including the United Kingdom, it's well known that abortion rates for conceptions tested with Down syndrome is around 90%. And Iceland has essentially eradicated Down syndrome, as one geneticist put it. And Denmark is also, to use again the language of scientists, is nearing the extinction of Down syndrome. And there's been universal screening since 2004. Screening in the US is on a similar trajectory, though, and this is very interesting. I was talking to a social scientist in Chicago who's trying to compile data on what the rates are in the United States, specifically among evangelical Christians. And his first observation was that the US is the most highly data captured society in the world, and abortion rates for Down syndrome pregnancies are not routinely collected. So as a social scientist, he remarked that this is clearly an intentional resistance to tracking this domain and what we're doing in this domain. But anecdotal evidence is pretty clear that US rates are not terribly different from other developed nations. And because the reasons given for aborting Down syndrome pregnancies are pretty similar across the developed West. And these questions are only going to become more pressing because only in 2010, as I'll talk about a bit more in a minute, has the test for Down syndrome in utero been made a sort of blood test. So you take the mother's blood, and it's very non-invasive and very straightforward, and you can get a kind of genetic diagnosis from that. So the question is really going to explode really soon. Now, you may not have heard about a flap provoked by Richard Dawkins in 2014 when he was asked in a kind of blog forum by a woman what he would suggest happening if a woman was diagnosed as pregnant with a Down syndrome child. And he tweeted back, "Abort it and try again. It would be immoral to bring it into the world if you have the choice." That blunt way of putting it caused quite a firestorm, as you can imagine. And he issued a further, slightly wordier version of the claim, not backing down, but elaborating in this way. "If your morality is based, as mine is, on the desire to increase the sum of happiness and reduce suffering, the decision to deliberately give birth to a Down's baby when you have the choice to abort it early in the pregnancy might actually be immoral from the point of view of the child's own welfare." So Dawkins, it's worth just cataloging what he assumes, that Down syndrome is a fault, it's a kind of biological accident, and that we have the technology to detect and delete this fault relatively straightforwardly and painlessly, and modern people should want to activate a world a better place, and therefore aborting Down syndrome is morally incumbent, and he also assumes is reducing suffering because he's clearly presuming that to live a life with Down syndrome is best characterized as a life of suffering. Now, I want to introduce you to these two beautiful people. This is my wife, Stephanie, and my son, Adam, and she's a Southern Californian. There's a lot of beautiful people in Southern California, and I was lucky enough to meet and marry one. And our first child, Adam, came along 6 or 7 years later, and they've both given me permission to talk about them in this forum. Adam was conceived while I was finishing up my PhD in London, and we moved from there to Germany to do postdoctoral work when she was 7 months pregnant, which is about it was weeks away from the legal cutoff date for abortion. But she wasn't interested in exploring abortion. She was willing to carry to term the baby that felt to her very normal, that it was a normal pregnancy. And so when we got to Germany and she got into the prenatal care routines, she said, I only need the testing that is for the purposes of a healthy birth and a healthy child. So I don't need genetic testing. And what she discovered is that this was a provocative act, that by picking and choosing between what was being offered to her, it provoked resistance, because it essentially implied that the prenatal screening was detachable from prenatal care practice. So her experience was paralleled by a woman named Yami Johnson. And let me just read this passage. She's a Brooklyn mother grappling with a prenatal diagnosis last year. She said that one doctor set her down with her husband and asked them how many children they already had. Is this the legacy you want to leave them? Johnson recalled the doctor asking. You're not going to live forever. Stephanie's version of that conversation was from when she was pregnant her second time around, and once again said, I'm not interested in screening this pregnancy. And the doctor said, well, I mean, are you sure you're prepared to have another child like Adam? And she said, I'm a neonatal nurse and my husband is a medical ethicist. Yeah, we're sure that we know what we're getting into. But the presumption, even for a medically trained nurse, needs to be really sort of morally cajoled to understand the stakes in making this decision. By the way, that article by Ruther Graham, Choosing Life with Down Syndrome in Slate, is a really good and up-to-date summary of the issues that I'm discussing today. So I want to highlight the changing assumptions about good citizenship in the context of our political ethos today as it relates to prenatal screening. And the first is that we'll only care for those children who reach a quality standard. Right? So that, I'm drawing a distinction between prenatal care, which is the medicine that you apply to try to create the best outcomes for mother and child, and prenatal screening, which is the tools and techniques that you apply to make sure that certain people don't come into the world. And it's important to notice and to meditate on what we're saying when we say you're not going to get care unless you go through screening. Once we've made the turn to sequencing those two procedures, then we're faced continually with the question of whether screening is going to yield a positive answer to, yes, we will let this particular person into our society. We'll love this person, or we'll call this person a non-person and we'll reject them from society. So not only can we, but we should deny citizenship, full personhood, to some people if they're deemed medically faulty. So the upshot is that our political culture is one in which it is presumed that every human being is going to be routinely quality tested before they're going to be loved by their parents and accepted and supported in their society. So I'm bringing you up to the present. There's a horizon opening up for a new world that is really very, very new. Prenatal diagnosis itself, which is a very cumbersome process, was only developed about 1968, which was about the same time as the liberalization of abortion laws, meaning the legalization of abortion. So only when you could do something about a problematic diagnosis wasn't really worth developing the technology. So it's sort of interesting to note that the rise of prenatal diagnosis coincided very directly with the rise of legalization of abortion. And up into the 90s, chorionic villus sampling was the sort of technical term for what you had to do to know the genetic palette of a child in the womb, and that had to be done by extracting amniotic fluid, which was a dangerous procedure and resulted in spontaneous abortion in a significant number of cases, right? So in some ways, the riskiness of getting a diagnosis made it a little more of a fraught question of how you know whether you have a faulty pregnancy or not. But as I've hinted at before, in 2010, there's really been the perfection of a blood test that's non-invasive and therefore not dangerous, and it poses no risk to the child in the womb. Now, I want to sort of pause at this point because we're obviously in a very febrile, complex period around abortion law and abortion policy. And I want to distinguish between legal abortion versus selective abortion. There's a lot of moves going on right now that are causing a lot of cultural heat with some states trying to continually reduce in some not necessarily above board ways access to abortion. I'm not at this point discussing the recriminalization of abortion, and I think we need to have a very different discussion, and I would say my punchline there would probably be, in a de-Christianizing society, the idea of recriminalizing abortion is going to be a very complicated one for Christians to defend, even if they're anti-abortion. So what I'm doing today is asking us to consider one set of reasons that make it seem right or even rational or even normal to abort some people. And that's the selective abortion question. Whoops. So I want to stress, so that this doesn't create a firestorm like Dawkins set off, that these are very different kinds of questions, selection versus legality, and that the abortion debate is typically not asking the selection question in a very serious way. And I'm trying to bring this facet of the discussion into the foreground. So the term that often comes up in these contexts is eugenics. And we have a picture of eugenics that uses the Nazi termination program as its icon. And that is often described as being about improving the gene pool. So it's a kind of breeding picture. The gene pool has bad genes and good genes, and eugenics is the practice of one way or the other eliminating the bad genes to make the whole pool better. That's the old view of eugenics. And I'm going to suggest that we're coming into a time when eugenics and eugenics policy won't be labeled eugenics policy, but it will be connected with our liberal political culture's emphasis on letting people choose. There's an assumption that if we let people choose, whether to continue pregnancies or not. This is the selective abortion question. Most people are going to make rational choices. And I want to explain this technical point in a tiny bit more detail. The political philosopher N. Waldschmidt has called this normalistic moral norms. completely voluntarily in line with ideals of autonomy and self-determination. We orient ourselves to the middle of society, to average norms. We want to live the way that other people do. Most importantly, we want to be normal. And if we feel enjoyment at deviation, it's only because we want to march to the beat of a different drummer, but only for a little while. By no means do we want to be permanently localized at the negative pole of the spectrum of a certain behavior or characteristic. Now, she's sort of put this in more generic terms, like nobody wants to be the deviant one, except for the ones who really want to be deviant ones. So we're used to the idea of the rebel. She's not talking about the idea of the rebel. She's talking about the way our political culture structures legitimate behavior and illegitimate behavior. Older regimes, we're all used to, in our minds, we are in many ways working with an outdated image. We think that law works like this. Lawmakers make a law, they decree certain things illegal. Cops go out there and they stop bad people doing illegal things and they throw them in jail. And by that means, we rid society of transgressors, right? So in that older picture, lawmakers decreed some behaviors legal and illegal, and if you breached a legal norm, then you were punished. This is a kind of larger question I'm not going to go into in much detail, but we live in an era, a neoliberal market economy era, in which incentives do all the work. So we don't have to say it's illegal to do insider trading. We just sort of tax it, or we give fines. We incentivize normal behaviors, what most people are doing, and we disincentivize outlying behaviors, statistically speaking. You know, if you're like me, almost math illiterate, you can at least recognize that statistical curves are bell curves, right? There's a lot of people in the middle, and there's a few people out at the ends of the curve. And modern governance is not about cutting off certain behaviors. It's about shifting the middle of that curve over and trying to get rid of the tails. And that has the benefit of making nobody feel like they're coerced, right? So we're all white-collar criminals. We all just get sort of pushed toward thinking that, okay, well, I want to speed now, and I'm willing to pay the fine, so I'll go ahead and speed, right? I'll become an outlier by driving 100 instead of 80, and I'm willing to pay the cost of that, right? And we're used to business talk being put together that way, right? Like, we polluted this much, but we knew that the fine wasn't really, that the profits we would make by polluting this much were worth it. So nobody feels coerced. It's all a kind of economic calculation. And our political governance structures assume that that's actually a more efficient way to govern, to get more people to do the right thing without causing protest. So that's our status quo. But it is the case that some people continue to march to the beat of a different drummer.
And you got your stick.
It doesn't sound like we have the audio, but this is Adam, the baby you saw in the incubator earlier on. He's now 16, but here he's 15. We're walking very near our house in Scotland, and you can't hear my wife speaking to him, but she's getting close, so he's giving her an elbow, and oh, there she is.
Mom.
She's speaking to him, and he's sort of visually reacting to her. You're going to see here's our dog, and there's
them too.
Caleb and Agnes, my other two children, walking just as you do in Scotland.
Say bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye.
So Adam is, as you saw, walking. It's a useful image because he walks in his own way. He's got his flippy toy, we call it. He also has autism, so sometimes he likes to swing things, so he's got that there. And you could see that he's not speaking it in return to Stephanie's queries, but he's also clearly very interactive. So medicine saved this child and has given him to us for the duration of his life, and yet he's the sort of citizen in our status quo who is an outlier that our political culture is increasingly eradicating. Now, Dawkins, we've already had, I already showed you his initial tweet saying, if you're pregnant with Down's child, you should go ahead and abort. It'd be immoral not to abort. And after the firestorm, he was forced to sort of not only do that clarification that I read you, but he then went on and had a whole blog on his site. Now, it's kind of hard to see it, but his foundation is called the Foundation for Reason and Science, very nicely encapsulating the definition of progress and its material filling out technologically. So he's the voice of reason and progress, he says, and his apology, if you look in the fine print, is not an apology for what I said. It's apology for provoking the crazies, basically, letting loose the dogs of Twitter war. Well, the dogs of Twitter war were the people who objected to his claim. So in his further clarification of his clarification, he continued, in overview, and I'm summarizing here first before I give you his own words, yeah, there are some religious people who oppose abortion, but I'm just telling you what most people think today, right? Again, the norm. I'm articulating the normal. And he, in his own words, might that not give you pause before you accuse one individual, me, of being a brute simply because he spells out the thinking behind the majority choice? So Dawkins, I'm suggesting, is probably right about what most people believe. When he says outright and out loud, without apology, if you become pregnant with a child who's tested to be genetically, quote unquote, faulty, you should abort them. Because it's what most people think, and it reduces suffering in the world, and it makes the world a better place. Stephanie certainly discovered what it means to be outside the statistical mainstream. I read you the quote from the lady who said, she was patronizingly explained why she really needed to prenatally test. In the book, Stephanie and I wrote a much longer chapter explaining the details of the pressure that she experienced when saying, I'm not really interested in prenatal screening. So being outside of the statistical mainstream may not be illegal, but it certainly provokes strong resistance, and that resistance has a logic. Some Christians, it's been fun to discover, recognize that logic, they recognize those practices, and they have intentionally pushed back against them. We know Christians in Durham, North Carolina, and Muncie, Indiana, and in Hong Kong who have gone out of their way to adopt children who are genetically faulty according to our contemporary mind. And they're sort of pushing back against the sense that quality control has made mistakes in these cases. And in that, I want to suggest their resistance to the status quo continues a very Christian impulse that is evident in the Roman period. And the Roman status quo was that the father had total legal rights to accept or reject a child. The paterfamilias is the technical name for the father and his legal right which was exercised by a ritual act of picking a child up from the floor, a newborn, and only when the father had done that did the child become a legal citizen. And up to that point, the child could be legally done with in any way that the family chose. And so, and typically there were economic considerations involved. How many mouths do you have to feed? Will this person be a burden, or will they add something to the society? And if the decision of the head of the household was that this child will be a burden, the typical procedure was to leave the children out for exposure, or just either put them in the marketplace and let someone else take them, or put them on a hillside and let an animal take them. But from the first centuries, Christians are well known to have rescued these children, foundlings, and in doing so, fundamentally reshaping the Western view of what it means to be a child. They, by definition, were taking every child as valuable in their own right, whether they were legally recognized or not. And that act was one of the germs of the world in which we live today, where we have things like the Declaration of Human Rights for Children, which would be unthinkable in a pre-Christian universe. So I just want to end by summarizing the themes that we can draw from the resistance to the status quo that we see among Christians now and in the patristic era. And here, of course, we have the famous shot, or one of many famous shots, of Pope Francis greeting, in this case, a young man with cerebral palsy. And you can see how delighted and how countercultural it is how delighted the young man is, and how countercultural that icon is. If we just think about what that's representing, it's not something that we've seen from heads of state or religious heads very often in the modern world. So the connections, I would draw three connections between the Christians that I've talked about who are resisting the status quo today and the resistance to the status quo in the Roman period by early Christians. First, they repudiate the idea, or any ideas, that only perfect bodies are worthwhile. So they resist the aesthetics that would say somebody like with cerebral palsy has is not beautiful. They could see a beauty that would never appear in our world on a magazine cover, and would never appear in the ancient world in the stories of the heroes. And with that goes a theological judgment that for them, the shame or embarrassment around non-human lives that we experience, our discomfort with people who seem different, or who seem awkward, or who drool, or who don't talk, that's a mark of sin, and specifically our sin. So we tend to talk about disability in Christian circles by starting with the fall, and the world is broken, and so there's broken people out there because the world has fallen. And I'm inviting you to think, along with the longer tradition of Christian thought, that the first, if we want to talk about sin and disability, the first sin is our sense that some people are repellent, right? The old, the patristic era, that theme was discussed under the heading of our response to lepers who were disfigured, famously disfigured. And we might think today in our terms about someone who's a burn victim. Much of the work in this domain amongst early Christians highlighted how sinful it is that we don't want to talk to someone like a burn victim who just makes us recoil. And that was where a lot of the work theologically went on, thinking about these issues. So I'm going to end by answering the initial question: who is a good citizen? In our world, in this domain, we probably should say that there's actually rival citizenships. In our modern progressive technological quality controlled society, there's a definition that assumes some lives are faulty, and if at all possible, these should be eliminated as early as possible. And there's a picture of good citizenship that treats all life, all human life. And Augustine, the great patristic theologian, put it in its most succinct form. Anybody born from a human being is a human being and is God's good creation. So that's one polarity. Another polarity between rival definitions of good citizenship is good citizenship is enacted by those who are progressive, not revolutionary, but progressively making society better, and they're doing so prudentially, which means in our society using all the techniques at their disposal. And that's clearly not what was going on when the earliest Christians were pushing back against the Roman status quo. They thought, well, yeah, I mean, this might be another mouth to feed, and we might all have to eat less, and we might be hungrier, but it's the truth, and we're going to act this way as a witness to the truth of a God who was once all-powerful and has shed some of those capacities to come be with us. And that was obviously not to God's advantage. And that's the God who shows us that every human being is valuable in their own right. Finally, I think that yields a kind of summary encapsulation of rival ethos. One is a politics as serving collective self-improvement. Making ourselves great again would be another way to summarize that kind of politics, versus a society, a politics, a way of enacting citizenship that assumes all of society, everyone in society needs to have access to the goods and relationships that we all value. So that's it for me. Thank you for your attention.